The crystal champagne flute shattered against the silence of the ballroom, not because it was dropped, but because the sound of silver tapping against it had been so sharp, so demanding, that it felt like a crack in the veneer of the evening. It was the sound of Genevieve Sterling commanding attention, a sound that the 300 guests at the Plaza Hotel in New York City knew better than to ignore. I sat at the bride's family table, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles had turned the color of old bone. I watched my daughter, Clara, freeze next to her new husband, Julian. She looked like a porcelain doll that was about to be pushed off a shelf, her smile trembling, her eyes darting nervously toward me. Julian, handsome in that sharp, predatory way that old money often breeds, didn't look at her. He looked at his mother, Genevieve, with a smirk that was almost imperceptible, a conspiratorial glint that chilled the blood in my veins. Genevieve rose from her seat, a vision in silver silk that cost more than I had earned in the last decade working as a paralegal. She held a box wrapped in heavy, textured midnight blue paper. The room went quiet, that heavy, suffocating silence of people waiting for a show. "My darling Clara," Genevieve's voice projected effortlessly, honed by years of chairing charity galas and dismissing servants. "Welcome to the Sterling family. We have traditions, you see, standards. And since you come from such humble beginnings, I wanted to ensure you were properly equipped for your new role as Julian's wife." She handed the box to Clara. My daughter's fingers shook as she pulled the ribbon. The lid came off. The air in the room seemed to be sucked out as Clara lifted the item inside. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't an heirloom. It was a gray industrial cleaning tunic, the kind worn by the invisible staff who scrubbed the floors of buildings like the one we were standing in, accompanied by a heavy-duty scrub brush. "So you never forget that a wife's primary duty is to serve," Genevieve said, her smile not reaching her icy eyes. "And to keep Julian's world spotless. We wouldn't want you getting confused about your station just because you're wearing a Vera Wang gown today, would we?" A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the room, started by Genevieve's inner circle and dutifully echoed by those afraid to offend her. Julian laughed too, a bark of amusement. "Perfect, mother," he said, patting Clara's shoulder as if she were a well-behaved pet. "She'll put it to good use." Clara stood there, the gray polyester fabric clutching at her lace dress like a stain. She looked at me, her eyes filling with tears, begging for an exit, for the floor to open up. That was the moment the beast inside me woke up. It wasn't a beast of rage, but of cold, calculating protection. I was 58 years old, a widow who had scraped and saved every dollar since my husband died of a stroke 15 years ago. I had been invisible to these people all night, the quaint mother-in-law from Queens. But invisibility has its perks. It allows you to prepare without being seen. I stood up. The scrape of my chair leg against the parquet floor was loud, deliberate. I walked toward the head table. The murmurs died down. Genevieve looked at me with amused disdain, as if a fly had buzzed too close to her wine. "An interesting gift, Genevieve," I said, my voice steady, surprising even myself. I reached into my small beaded clutch. "Practical. It speaks volumes about your expectations." I stopped in front of Clara and Julian. I didn't look at Genevieve anymore. I looked at Julian, looking deep into his eyes, searching for a trace of the man Clara thought she was marrying, but finding only the arrogance of a boy who had never been told no. "Since we are exchanging practical gifts, I have one for my daughter as well." I pulled out a thick, folded document, bound in a blue legal cover. I placed it in Clara's hands, right on top of the gray tunic. "Open it, Clara." Clara unfolded the paper, her brow furrowing. As she read the bold text at the top, her breath hitched. "Mom?" she whispered. "What is this?" "Read it, honey," out loud. "Deed of trust," Clara read, her voice wavering but gaining strength. "Property located at 42 Willow Creek Lane, Hudson Valley. Owner, Clara Elizabeth Vance. Sole beneficiary." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of anticipation, it was the silence of shock. Julian frowned, snatching the paper from her hand. "A house? You bought her a house?" He looked at me, scoffing. "With what money? And why wasn't I consulted?" "It's a farmhouse, Julian," I said calmly. "It needs work. but it is fully paid for. And if you read the second page, you will see it is held in a strict spendthrift trust. It belongs to Clara, only Clara. It cannot be sold, mortgaged, or transferred without her explicit written consent, and in the event of a divorce, it is excluded from marital assets. It is a sanctuary, a place that is hers, and hers alone. Genevieve's face had turned a blotchy shade of red. "This is an insult," she hissed. "You are implying that my son cannot provide for his wife? You are preparing for a divorce before the cake is even cut?" "I am ensuring my daughter has a roof over her head that no one can take away," I replied, my gaze hardening. "I am ensuring that if she is ever made to feel like a servant in her own home, she has a place where she is the mistress." I turned to Clara, ignoring the gasps from the guests. "Clara, marriage is a partnership, not a servitude. You wear that dress because you are a bride, not a maid. And you own that house, so you are never, ever homeless." I kissed her cheek, turned, and walked back to my table. The rest of the reception was a blur of whispered gossip and icy glares from the Sterling clan. But I didn't care. I saw the way Clara's shoulders straightened. I saw her hand the gray tunic to a passing waiter and tuck the deed into her bodice. I knew I had planted a seed of strength, but I also knew that the storm was just beginning. Men like Julian Sterling do not like to lose control, and I had just publicly handed his wife the keys to a life he didn't own. The months following the wedding were a slow, creeping darkness. I had hoped my dramatic gesture would serve as a warning to Julian, a boundary line drawn in the sand. Instead, it became a challenge. The farmhouse in Hudson Valley sat empty for the first few weeks while they honeymooned in the Maldives, but the moment they returned, the war of attrition began. Clara called me less and less. When she did, her voice sounded thin, stretched tight like a wire about to snap. They were living in Julian's sleek, cold penthouse in Manhattan, a place of glass and steel where Clara told me she felt afraid to touch anything for fear of leaving a fingerprint. "He wants to sell the farmhouse?" "Mom," Clara whispered to me one afternoon in October. We were meeting for a quick coffee near her office. She was still working as a junior editor at a publishing house, a job she loved, though Julian constantly belittled the salary. "He can't sell it, Clara. That's the point of the trust," I reminded her, stirring my tea. "I know, but he says it's an insult to him. He says that if I loved him, I would break the trust, sell the place, and we could use the money to invest in his new venture capital fund. He says married couples shouldn't have secrets or separate assets." She looked down at her hands. I noticed she wasn't wearing the vintage pearl earrings I had given her for her 21st birthday. She was wearing simple diamond studs, cold and impersonal. "Clara, listen to me. Julian has millions. He doesn't need the money from a renovated farmhouse. He needs to know you are vulnerable. He wants to take away your exit strategy. He says you're manipulating me," she said, a tear slipping down her cheek. "He says you're jealous of his family's wealth, and you're trying to poison our marriage." "I am not the one asking you to give up your security," I said gently. "I am the one who gave it to you. There is a difference." But the pressure on her was immense. Julian was subtle at first. He didn't forbid her from seeing me. He just made it difficult. He would plan elaborate dinners on the nights we were supposed to meet. He would surprise her with weekend trips to the Hamptons when I was scheduled to visit. Slowly, he was pruning the branches of her life until only he remained. The turning point came in January. Clara arrived at my apartment in Queens unannounced on a Tuesday night. She looked terrible. Her beautiful auburn hair was pulled back in a severe, messy bun, and she wore no makeup, which was unlike her. But what terrified me was the look in her eyes, a dull, flat resignation. "I'm pregnant," she said, sitting heavily on my worn velvet sofa. My heart leaped with instinctive joy, but it was immediately strangled by fear. "Oh, honey, are you happy?" "I was," she said, her voice trembling. "I told Julian last night. He was thrilled. He opened a bottle of vintage wine to celebrate. And then he told me the plan." "What plan?" "He said that now that we're having a baby, I need to quit my job. He said the publishing industry is too stressful and doesn't pay enough to justify the time away from his child. And he said," she took a ragged breath, "he said we need to liquidate the farmhouse. He's already found a buyer. He said he won't have his child's mother holding onto a shack as a backup plan. He said if I don't sell it and put the money into our joint account, it proves I'm not committed to this family. Clara, you cannot quit your job, and you absolutely cannot sell that house. He's giving me an ultimatum, Mom, she cried out. He said if I don't do this, he'll fight for full custody if we ever split. He said he has the best lawyers in the city. He said he'll paint me as unstable. He is bluffing, I said, though I felt a cold dread in my stomach. He is trying to scare you into submission. The farmhouse is your safety net. If you give that up, and you give up your job, you will be completely dependent on him. You will have to ask him for money to buy diapers. You will have to ask permission to leave the house. Is that the life you want? Clara wept for an hour, the deep, racking sobs of a woman realizing her fairy tale was a horror story in disguise. I held her, rocking her like I did when she was a child. I told her about the trust, about how ironclad it was, how my boss at the law firm, a shark of a man named Mr. Henderson, had drafted it specifically to withstand men like Julian. Go back to him, I told her, making the hardest decision of my life. But do not sign anything. Tell him the trust is legally unbreakable without a 2-year waiting period. Lie if you have to. Buy time. And keep your job. Tell him you'll quit after the baby is born. Just hold your ground. She went back. And for a few months, things went quiet. Too quiet. I didn't see Clara for 6 weeks. Every time I called, it went to voicemail. I received brief, generic text messages. I'm fine, just busy with the pregnancy. Julian and I are working things out. Please don't come over, he stressed. I drove out to the farmhouse in the Hudson Valley one weekend just to check on it. It was a beautiful place, an old Victorian I had bought as a foreclosure and spent 5 years restoring with my own hands on weekends. I had imagined Clara raising her children there, running in the apple orchard. When I arrived, I found the locks had been changed. Not on the farmhouse, Julian couldn't touch that, but my key to Clara's apartment in the city no longer worked. I knew this because I drove straight back to Manhattan and tried to get into their building. The doorman, a man I had known for a year, looked at me with pity. Mrs. Vance, I can't let you up, he said quietly. Mr. Sterling left strict instructions. No visitors for Mrs. Sterling. She's on bed rest. Bed rest? I demanded. She's only 4 months pregnant. I'm sorry, ma'am. If I let you up, I lose my job. I stood on the sidewalk of Park Avenue, looking up at the penthouse windows. They were dark. A primal fear gripped me. This wasn't just a bad marriage anymore. This was captivity. I went to the police precinct. I tried to file a welfare check. The officer behind the desk looked at Julian's name on the report and sighed. Ma'am, unless you have proof of violence, there's not much we can do. Husbands and wives argue. If she's not calling for help, we can't just kick down the door of a Sterling. I realized then that the law was a blunt instrument, and Julian was insulated by layers of money and influence. I had to be smarter. I had to wait for an opening. The opening came 3 weeks later, in the form of a frantic, 3-second phone call at 2 a.m. Mom. Hudson. Key. Under the loose brick. Help. The line went dead. I didn't hesitate. I didn't call the police again. They would take too long, and Julian would talk his way out of it. I called my brother, Frank. Frank was a retired union carpenter, a man the size of a vending machine with hands like shovels and a heart of gold. He hated Julian from the moment they met. Frank, bring your truck, I said, and your crowbar. We drove to the city. It was raining, a cold, miserable March rain. We didn't go to the penthouse. Clara had said Hudson. She meant the farmhouse. Julian must have taken her there. It made sense. It was isolated, far from the prying eyes of the city, a place where he could break her will without witnesses. We arrived at the farmhouse just before dawn. The house was dark, sitting ominously against the gray sky. Julian's sleek black Range Rover was parked in the gravel driveway. My heart hammered against my ribs. Stay here, Frank said, grabbing a heavy flashlight. No, I'm coming. We approached the front door, locked. I checked the loose brick in the garden wall where I used to hide a spare key during renovations. It was gone. Julian must have found it. We circled the house. The windows were dark, but on the second floor, the master bedroom, I saw a faint flicker of light. A candle? I picked up a rock from the garden path. Frank, the back door. The glass pane. Frank nodded. He wrapped his jacket around his arm and smashed the pane of the kitchen door. The sound was swallowed by the wind. He reached in and unlocked it. We were in. The house was freezing. The heating had been turned off. "Clara!" I screamed, running up the stairs. "Clara! Mom!" A muffled cry from the master bedroom. I tried the door. Locked. Not just locked, but bolted from the outside. A heavy-duty slide bolt had been installed on the hallway side of the beautiful oak door. My blood ran cold. He was treating her like an animal in a cage. Frank didn't wait. He slammed his shoulder into the door. The wood splintered. He hit it again, a grunt of effort escaping his lips. The door flew open. Clara was huddled in the corner of the room, wrapped in a duvet. She looked emaciated. Her eyes were wide with terror. There was no electricity in the room. She had burned a small decorative candle down to the nub. "Mom!" She scrambled up and threw herself into my arms. She was shaking so violently her teeth rattled. He left 2 days ago. He said he wouldn't come back until I signed the papers. He turned off the power. There's no food. He left you here?" I touched her face, my hands trembling with rage. "Pregnant? And alone in the freezing cold?" He took my phone. He locked the door. "Well, isn't this a touching family reunion?" The voice came from the doorway. We spun around. Julian was standing there, leaning against the broken doorframe. He looked immaculate in a cashmere coat, holding a coffee cup as if he were watching a boring play. He must have been sleeping in the guest cottage out back, waiting for her to break. "You're trespassing," Julian said calmly. "Frank, is it? I'll have you arrested for breaking and entering. You locked my pregnant daughter in a freezing room for 2 days," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "That is unlawful imprisonment. That is endangerment. That is torture." Julian laughed. "She's my wife." She was having a hysterical episode. I did what was necessary to calm her down. I was right here on the property the whole time. I was waiting for her to come to her senses and sign the sale agreement. He looked at Clara with disgust. "Look at you. Pathetic. Running to mommy because you can't handle being an adult." Clara shrank back. But I stepped in front of her. "She is leaving, Julian. Now. She's not going anywhere with my child inside her." Julian took a step forward. Frank stepped in front of me. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, 6 feet 4 inches of blue-collar muscle, holding a crowbar loosely at his side. He looked at Julian with the kind of calm indifference a butcher has for a piece of meat. Julian stopped. He looked at the crowbar, then at Frank's face. The arrogance in his eyes flickered and died, replaced by the cowardice that always hides behind bullies. He sneered. "Fine, take her. She's useless to me like this anyway. But you'll be hearing from my lawyers. You'll be destitute by the time I'm done with you." "Save your money, Julian," I said, guiding Clara past him. "You're going to need it for the criminal defense attorney." We drove Clara straight to the hospital. She was dehydrated and suffering from mild hypothermia, but the baby was fine. The doctors documented everything: the bruises on her wrists where he had grabbed her, the malnutrition, the psychological trauma. This time, the police listened. With the medical report and Frank's testimony, we got a temporary restraining order within 24 hours. The divorce was not a battle. It was a scorched earth campaign. Julian's family unleashed their legal hounds. They tried to invalidate the trust. They tried to claim Clara was mentally unstable. They tried to bankrupt me with legal fees. But they underestimated 2 things. First, the meticulousness of the trust I had created. It held up in court like a fortress. The farmhouse remained Clara's. Second, the power of a mother's rage. I cashed in my retirement. I took out loans. I didn't care if I ended up eating cat food for the rest of my life. My daughter was going to be free. The turning point in the legal war came when Genevieve Sterling took the stand. She was arrogant, dismissing the judge's questions with haughty waves of her hand. When asked about the Maid uniform, she rolled her eyes. "It was a joke," she said. "A lesson in humility." "And locking a pregnant woman in a room without heat?" my lawyer asked. "Was that a lesson too?" "She was hysterical," Genevieve snapped. "Julian was managing her. That girl was always too fragile for our world. The judge, a stern woman who had clearly dealt with too many men like Julian, looked at Genevieve over her glasses. Mrs. Sterling, in my courtroom, stripping a human being of their dignity and safety is not managing them, it is abuse. We won. Not everything. Julian's lawyers managed to protect most of his assets, but we won what mattered. Clara got full physical custody of the baby. With Julian allowed only supervised visits, she kept the farmhouse. And she got her freedom. 3 years have passed since that night. The farmhouse is different now. It's no longer a cold, empty shell. It is filled with the chaotic, beautiful noise of life. There are toys scattered on the Persian rug in the living room. The kitchen smells of cinnamon and apples. Clara didn't go back to the publishing house in the city. Instead, she started a small editing consultancy from home. She works on the porch, looking out at the apple trees. She is different, too. The fear is gone from her eyes, replaced by a quiet, steely resilience. She doesn't laugh as easily as she used to, but when she does, it is real. I live in the guest cottage now, the same one where Julian had slept while tormenting her. We reclaimed it. I help with the baby, a little boy named Leo who has Clara's red hair and my husband's kind eyes. Julian comes for his supervised visits once a month. He arrives in a different luxury car each time, looking older, harder. He tries to buy Leo's affection with expensive, inappropriate toys, drones, electric cars, things a 3-year-old can't use. Leo is polite but distant. He knows, with the instinctive wisdom of children, that this man is cold. Genevieve died a year ago, alone in her massive estate. We heard she had alienated everyone in her final months, even Julian. There was no one left to impress. Today, I sat on the porch swing, watching Clara push Leo on the tire swing, hanging from the old oak tree. She was wearing jeans and a t-shirt, her hair loose in the wind. She looked over at me and smiled, a smile of pure, unadulterated peace. "You know, Mom," she said, walking over and sitting beside me. "I used to hate this house when everything was happening. I felt like it was the reason he turned on me." "It wasn't the house, Clara," I said, taking her hand. "The house just revealed who he really was. It forced him to show his hand." "I know," she leaned her head on my shoulder. "But now I look at it, and I don't see a building. I see a shield. I see the thing that kept me from drowning." "That was the plan," I whispered. "I'm going to change the deed," she said suddenly. I sat up, alarmed. "What? Why?" "I'm adding Leo to the trust," she said, squeezing my hand. "And I'm adding a clause. If he ever marries, his partner gets a separate deed to a small piece of the land, in their own name." I smiled, tears pricking my eyes. "Why would you do that?" "So that the cycle ends with us," Clara said firmly. "So that no one in this family ever has to wonder if they have a place to go when the storm comes." I looked out at the rolling hills of the Hudson Valley, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and purple. I thought about the maid's uniform, rotting in a landfill somewhere. I thought about the broken doorframe upstairs, which we had repaired but left a small scar in the wood as a reminder. We often think that love is about merging, about becoming one. But true love, the kind that saves you, is about ensuring the other person can stand alone if they have to. I had given my daughter a house, but she had turned it into a home. And in doing so, she had built the one thing money can't buy and cruelty can't take away: a life of her own design. "That sounds like a perfect plan," I said. And as the fireflies began to blink in the twilight, I knew that we were finally, truly safe.